Hi, this is John Hall, and welcome to a bonus episode. For the last several months, the Beer Travelers podcast has been going around the world exploring the brewing scene of different cities. It's hosted by my colleague Andy Crouch, and new episodes are available each month on the All About Beer podcast channel. This episode that you're about to hear is all about the wonderful city that is Milwaukee. You can hear regular episodes of the Beer Travelers podcast, as well as Brewer to Brewer and the All About Beer podcast by simply searching All About Beer on your podcast platform of choice. And if you believe in quality journalism and content, I hope you'll give our Patreon a look. It's patreon.com/allaboutbeer. Or you can learn more about advertising on the shows by emailing info@allaboutbeer.com. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of Drink Beer, Think Beer. But for now, please enjoy Beer Travelers with Andy Crouch.
Welcome to the Beer Travelers podcast from All About Beer. I'm your host, Andy Crouch. And we'll get to our conversation about Milwaukee's thriving beer scene in a minute. But first, a quick word from our sponsors. All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts. Wisconsin is one of those places that lives in the imaginations of Americans, largely in the form of caricature. Full of cheese curd eating, beer-loving Harley riders, the state rarely gets the respect it deserves. In reality, Wisconsin is all of those things, and so much more. I grew up 90 minutes south of Milwaukee, but it might as well have been a totally different country. Chicago is Midwestern in the way that non-alcoholic beer is beer, in name only. Wisconsin, on the other hand, is pure Midwest. From Friday night fish fries to the homey environs of supper clubs, and a relatively laid-back sense of community and good-spiritedness, Wisconsin is the heart of the Midwest for me. So today, I'm excited that in the latest episode of Beer Travelers, we're making our way to one of the great overlooked gems in the American craft beer scene, Milwaukee. To help lead us through this town's glorious and storied beer scene, we have two fantastic local guides. Chris Drosner is a longtime beer writer and editor covering Wisconsin and Milwaukee specifically. He's written the Beer Baron column for the Wisconsin State Journal, the daily newspaper in the capital city of Madison. And it's through this column that I first got to know Chris and his take on the Madtown and greater Wisconsin beer scenes. More recently, Chris moved to Milwaukee, where he is now the executive editor of Milwaukee Magazine. Joining Chris to help us on our tour of Brewer City, this week is Bobby Tanzillo, the senior editor at onmilwaukee.com, where he writes about beer, whiskey, history, and architecture. He's the author of a half-dozen history books, including several about beer and its history in Milwaukee, and he's a great resource for all the beer happenings in the city. While Chris and Bobby compete for scoops on the latest beer news in the city, it's clear that they have a deep respect for one another, and they are the perfect pair to help us navigate this jewel on Lake Michigan. So let's get started on our exploration of one of my favorite local beer scenes, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Today, we're making our way to one of my favorite cities for beer, one of the great overlooked gems in the American craft beer scene, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee was always known as kind of a macro beer city, one of America's two great beer cities. But Milwaukee has a lot to offer, whether it's history and architecture, and more particularly for our purposes today, we're talking about craft beer and a lot of what Milwaukee has had come to pass in most recent years. And to do that, we have two fantastic experts, folks who have written about the beer scene in Milwaukee for a long time, have deep understandings of that scene. And I'm really looking forward to getting back to a city that I've spent a lot of time in. I think Milwaukee is both a city and a beer scene that doesn't get enough respect in this country. And I think, the town itself is beautiful. The architecture is amazing. The history is great. And it has this long, beer history, dating back to Miller and Pabst and Schlitz and all these great historic brands, legacy brands. And I want to get into that today, and then also talk a lot about, what's going on in Milwaukee, in the more modern era. So we'll start with Chris. For those who haven't been to Milwaukee before, how would you describe both the city and the beer scene?
Well, I echo your sentiments about the city. It's I've only lived here for about 8 years or so, but it is actually we're coming up on 10 now. But it's it's a great city by a great lake that used to be its trademark, but there's a lot going on, and there's a lot going on that's kind of new. And I think that's definitely the way I would describe the beer scene as well. It's robust, but it hadn't for a long time. It hadn't been talked about in terms of those craft beer destinations that are talked about around the country. But I think that we're punching at least at our weight, if not above it at this point. There was a major boom about in 2016 and 2017 where we saw really almost like the creation of a craft beer scene with all kinds of different types of craft breweries, sizes and models and all that kind of stuff opening within the span of about 2 or 3 years, and it's pretty much continued along those lines since then. So at this point, we do have, I would say, a real nice beer scene. Certainly one that you could spend a weekend or even a week exploring if that's your bag.
And Bobby, how about yourself? For someone who has covered the beer scene there for a long time, how would you describe Milwaukee's beer scene?
I'd agree with what Chris said, and I would say that since the boom has happened, it's been fairly stable. We get a few new ones opening here and there, and occasionally a closure, but there hasn't been a massive wave of openings or closings since that time. And I think that at the moment, it might even be a little under capacity if you look at it sort of on a neighborhood by neighborhood basis. I think we have probably about 40 breweries in the metro area, but there's like an entire swath of the south side of the city that has nothing. So I feel like there is probably still a little bit of capacity out there for anybody who's looking to open something.
And that's not something we necessarily hear about a lot of cities. Most places are now just kind of over capacity or have so many, especially the city to the south where I grew up in Chicago, where I think the number may be north of 150. And I've lost control of that beer scene the better part of a decade ago. But for those who aren't familiar with kind of the history of beer in Milwaukee, and I know that this is books and books and tomes have been written about this. We'll start with Bobby. Can you just walk us through the very short version of brewing history in Milwaukee?
Yeah, so as you had pointed to earlier, Milwaukee has long been known as a sort of macro beer city because for a long time we had Miller, Pabst, and Schlitz. And Pabst was the biggest for a while in the country, if not the world, and Schlitz was not far behind. And it's funny that we think of Miller as being this huge company because it was traditionally the smaller of the big brewing giants here. But brewing here goes back to 1840. We had an English style ale brewery open up, and then quickly after that, there's a lager brewery, and then Pabst opens. And by the late 19th century, there's Pabst, Miller, Schlitz, Blatz, Cream City, Husting, Falk, Gettleman. I mean, just on and on and on.
I love the names.
Yeah, and just tons and tons of breweries. And but of course, the beginning of craft, I feel like, and Chris can expand on this or correct me on this, but I feel like we sort of had a strong showing at the start. We had Sprecher here in 84, Lakefront opened by 87. We had our first brew pub, Water Street Brewery was, I think, also 87. So we sort of started off strong in that sense, but then for some reason it never really exploded here like it did in other cities after that until about 5, 6, 7 years ago.
I was going to say, I think the history and the legacy and the shadow of the big beer industry in the city was pulling at both ends of that. I think Randy Sprecher, who founded Sprecher Brewery in, I believe it was 84, you said, right?
Yep.
So I mean, that was Milwaukee's. I don't know if they say it was Milwaukee's first craft, but it's the oldest one that's surviving still today.
Yeah. And he worked at Pabst. He
was a Pabst guy, right? So there's a talent, and then the next one, Lakefront. Those guys were home brewers. So kind of different paths. But I think a continuing story through today is the kind of talent magnet and talent generator and developer that the big breweries have been. But from the market perspective, I think I think people were slow to adopt some of these craft breweries and really kind of buy in to. So I think that was what was keeping it, small. I don't think it was anything nefarious, like, backroom, deal killing, stuff like that. But I think it was just that nobody really felt like it was needed for a long time. And then obviously, when I was in, I was working in Madison for a long time, up until 2017, and that city was quite a bit more robust. And I don't think that's the case anymore.
And if you think about it, Pabst was open here until the late 90s too. So there was still a lot of, as you point, dedication to, I'm a Miller Lite guy, I'm a Miller High Life guy, I'm a PBR guy. And I think people were held on to that pretty tightly in some respects because they worked at these places or their parents worked at these places, or, I mean, they felt like a physical connection to them the way that I think that now the craft breweries.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and just the connection that folks and local drinkers had to, and the passion they had for, the breweries that have defined their local beer scene for 100 plus, more than 150 years at that point. Yeah, there is going to be some loyalty there, but it's interesting to see some of these players who decided to kind of try to break out of that and to bring a little bit more flavor. And we touched on, I think, at least one of them, with Lakefront. And let's talk about, some who are the original craft beer players in the city. And, we can start with Bobby. Talk to me about, just sort of the history of Lakefront and what it has meant to the development of craft beer in Milwaukee.
Yeah, so they got started in a neighborhood called River West, which is kind of a scrappy neighborhood that's sort of mixed ethnically and economically, and so it has sort of like an edgy feel to it. Like it's a popular place for, where bands play and, lots of cool bars and that sort of thing. So I think Lakefront was really kind of tapped into that from the get-go of being part of this kind of cool neighborhood. So it latched on in the neighborhood pretty quickly. And they worked hard brewing their stuff and getting it, self-distributing it around the city. And then they ultimately built a big facility in a former electrical power plant. And, they've been willing to do a wide variety of stuff, which I think has been helpful. They do lots of traditional German styles, which is popular here, but they also had, I think, the first gluten-free beer in New Grist. Yep. They do all kinds of hoppier beers. They do barrel-aged beers. So they do a little bit of everything, but it's also helped that they have, when they moved to the new place, they had a huge beer hall that has a popular fish fry and they had a polka band playing. So there's a whole vibe about the place as well as about the beer. And I think all of that kind of came together to make them sort of beloved. And the fact that now that they're 35 years old, they feel sort of like the stalwart.
Yeah, Lakefront's one of those breweries that I've spent some time in, because it's been some time since I've been there, and they were one of the originals. Russ, Klisch, one of the owners, is a character, and these, when one of the things that they were known for were putting on some of the best tours that you could find, some of the best brewery tours. And I remember going through there, and they had their whole shtick and their whole lineup and the things that they did, and they also had. I think they had horizontal ferment or conditioning tanks that at the time, and maybe they still do, had Larry, Moe, and Curly painted on the side of them. Yep. And also had, and maybe, Bobby, you can talk about this as well. They also had one particularly interesting item that they had gotten from the ballpark that I think had been either torn down or replaced. Yeah, I was actually while you were talking, I was going to say this, that they, to Mo, Larry, and Curly, who sections of which are now out front as they've upgraded their material, their equipment. They did buy Bernie's Chalet. Bernie Brewer is the brewer's mascot. He's got a big mustache, and he has this chalet house that when there's a home run, he slides down the slide and the fireworks go off. And when the Brewers built a new chalet, Lakefront bought the old chalet. So they've been doing a really good job of kind of latching on to these bits of Milwaukee history that resonate with people. And it's interesting because they also have these beautiful old lights that used to hang in a classic Milwaukee hotel in their tasting room. And so they really have done a good job of kind of just sort of
capturing the spirit of Milwaukee. And I think Milwaukee really feels like Lakefront speaks to them and represents them.
I think I'd interrupted you, Chris. What are your thoughts on Lakefront?
I think, I mean, I echo all that. I think to the point, two of their most popular beers year rounds, probably if you were going to pick like the craft beer of Milwaukee, it would be River West Stein, which is kind of a robust amber lager. Yep. That's like in the way that Spotted Cow is on tap in every bar in the state, pretty much. River West Stein is on at pretty much every bar in Milwaukee. But like, I think Lakefront's really underrated for like their actual beer program and what they do. They have a phenomenal barrel aging program. They've got one of the best events in the city with their Black Friday release, which is like still a big deal, where people camp out overnight on the day after Thanksgiving for 6 a.m. 14% barrel aged stouts. And they have this employee a series of beers where an employee just picks a beer that they want to make, and it's named after them. So like, there's My Turn Dylan and My Turn Andy and My Turn Hopgood. All these different employees from different parts of the brewery get their chance to make a beer that kind of they think reflects them and that they're into. And that's a great way of having a mostly very traditional brewery kind of advance and keep things fresh in a way that like makes sense for the brand and is like logical. Because I think a lot of breweries struggle with that. And it all seems very natural for Lakefront. It's like really one of the best breweries in the state. And I think it's really underrated for what they do just across the board.
And I think that My Turn series that you're talking about also is something that resonates with people, because they have, as you said, they have literally everybody who works in the company can do it. So it's not just the brewers, it's not just the people who work in the brewery, it's the people who work in the tap room, it's the people who load trucks and unload trucks. It's it's literally everybody. And I think that's the kind of thing that, again, that people really love. And it means there's variety every time you go there. There's something new and different to try.
And I think that's fantastic. As for a brewery that's even more than 10 years old, it can certainly be difficult to try to maintain your relevance in the current marketplace with all the changes. But if you're 35 years old, it's just exceedingly rare for breweries, first of all, to exist that long, but second of all, to maintain relevance and to have two acclaimed writers come on and say, yeah, this is a brewery that is still doing great stuff, and that's fantastic to hear. Chris had talked about one of the other breweries or one of the defining beers, or the defining beer of Milwaukee. But for me, at least in sort of my early years of craft brewing, one of the other defining beers of Milwaukee, and maybe one of the defining dark beers in the U.S. craft brewing, was Black Bavarian, which is a beer from Sprecher. Bobby, can you tell us a little bit about Randy Sprecher and the Sprecher Brewery?
Yeah, so Randy had worked at Pabst as a brewer. He was brewing beer at Pabst when he decided he wanted to go out on his own. And so he opened Sprecher in, again, I think it was an old power plant in an industrial part of the city. And he started making beer right away, but he was also making root beer right away. So he's always sort of had 1 foot in soda and 1 foot in beer. And actually nowadays, the soda by far outweighs the beer they make. But they still make Black Bavarian. They still make Sprecher Amber. They're still doing seasonal beers, always very rooted in German tradition. Randy was very interested in brewing German style beers. So it's lots of traditional stuff. They are doing more. He sold the company, I'm going to guess, about 5 years ago. And they've started doing more IPAs and barrel aged and things like that than they had been doing during the Randy era, but they still have their feet kind of firmly in that German tradition.
And Chris, can you talk to me about, obviously we've talked a little bit about Pabst and Schlitz, and I know that there are still some historic spaces there that are been utilized in recent years, and I actually don't really know the status of things like what has happened with the historic Pabst brewery. For beer lovers who are there, who are also interested in history and architecture, and we'll talk to Bobby about this as well, What are they able to see? What parts of beer history are they able to experience, and what's presently going on, with some of these historic brands? Are they still available? Are they still have an actual physical presence in the city?
Yeah, well, the big one is the Pabst, is the former Pabst complex, which was really a complex, and it was just on the edge, it was just on the edge of downtown, and there's a whole bunch of stuff going on in that area. There's let's see here, we've got the Central Waters Milwaukee brewery and tap room in a former church that is right on the edge of that complex. There's all kinds of like hotel. There's a big hotel there. You can actually sleep in what was the Pabst Brewery. All kinds of offices and but it's most of it is using the existing buildings so that the and Bobby can actually speak to this a lot better because it's right in his wheelhouse. But one big development that is kind of in the headlines, I guess, right now is the what's now the Pilot Project Brewery in a former Pabst warehouse, and that is a kind of an extension of a Chicago project or a Chicago brewery, I guess, that is basically an incubator for beer and beverage brands. So they kind of take these clients in and help them develop recipes or branding or even like concepts. And there's a lot of different kind of ways that they help these these independent companies. But they bought this big brewery, which had been the former Milwaukee Brewing Company facility, just this past fall, and now have opened a big. This is basically their growth engine for those brands that want to go big, maybe go national, that kind of thing. So that's all happening within the Pabst complex. But there's Bobby, you want to talk about the other? Like I know Schlitz Park is one. I think there's something going on in the Blatz Brewery too, right?
Yeah, so as you were saying, at the Pabst place in the church, there's Central Waters, but next to that, also in the old Pabst offices, there's a bar called Best Place, which is an event venue and a bar, and they have like a little gift shop, and you can go sit in the chair at Captain Pabst's desk in his old office. And as Chris was saying, the Brew House Inn and Suites, which is the hotel there in the lobby, still has in place the tops of the original copper kettles where Pabst brewed. Schlitz Park is mostly, which is the old Schlitz Brewery. A lot of the brew house buildings are gone, but some of them are still there. There's still a malt house. There's still a stables building. There's some packaging buildings and stuff that survive. And it's mostly offices, but there are some cafes and things in there. And you can kind of wander through there, and they have a lot of Schlitz memorabilia up and that sort of thing. Miller, I don't know that they've restarted the tours after the pandemic. They've been struggling to find staff basically to do the tours, but they're working on getting that reopened. So you could potentially do the Miller tour. And at Blatz, I don't think there's anything at Blatz that's really open to the public, but a lot of the buildings are still there, and Milwaukee School of Engineering occupies a lot of those. And if you find somebody who can take you around, there's still a Cream City Brewing Company building left. There's still a couple of Husting buildings left. Falk Brewery is still left. You can't go in any of them, but they're still there if somebody wanted to go see them. And the one thing I would say that people should probably not miss if they have a car while they're here is to go up to a brewery called Foxtown in Mequon, which is about 20 minutes north of the city. And they're open in like a early second half of the 19th century brewery building complex that has its brick lagering cave still underneath. And you can go down into those, and that's pretty amazing.
That does sound great. And thank you both for talking to me about the great history that Milwaukee has, and we barely dipped a toe into it, and there's so much more we could get into. But we'll be right back with more Beer Travelers after a message from our sponsors, and we're going to get into the modern day era of Milwaukee.
Want more beer for your ears? The new All About Beer podcast, hosted by M. Sauter and Don Tess, takes a deep, engaging dive into the hottest topics in beer. Do you need to know what the heck a cold IPA is? Check out the first episode wherever you get your pods. New episodes drop
every other Thursday. And now, back to Beer Travelers. Welcome back to the Milwaukee episode of Beer Travelers, and now we're going to get into what I've called a rapid-fire lightning round, but usually it's supposed to be quick questions and off-the-cuff answers, kind of the first things that come to your mind, but often it involves us just devolving into other areas and not getting that many questions out. So we'll see what people want to talk about today, but with its history, its heritage, we could talk about hazy breweries and all of these things, but I want to start somewhere else, a little bit closer and nearer and dearer to my heart. I'm going to go with Bobby. Bobby, what's the best German beer hall in Milwaukee?
Oh, that's got to be, well, I think it's Lakefront for sure. But for pure vibe, you also have to consider the Bavarian Beer House, which is in Glendale, right near Sprecher. So if you go up to Sprecher, you could also go up there. They have a really good fish fry, huge beer hall with big tables, and they have a brewery on site.
Half of the audience or more is not going to really understand maybe the fish fry, and certainly will not understand it in the Wisconsin context.
I have a lot to say on that.
Yeah, we're going to give you a tight 30 seconds to explain all that has to do with fish fries and supper clubs and just sort of what I would love to do a whole episode just on supper clubs alone. But Bobby, for the audience who did not understand the fish fry reference, please enlighten us.
Okay, so Fish Fry Friday is a big deal in Milwaukee, mostly I think because of the Catholic heritage, which they said there was no meat, you couldn't eat meat on Friday, so they started to do these fish fries, and it's usually fried fish and coleslaw and rye bread, and it has to have potato pancakes, because if it doesn't have potato pancakes, it's not a fish fry, it's just fried fish.
Fish and chips otherwise, right?
Right.
I love it. Chris, how about for you? What's the best German beer hall in Milwaukee?
Yeah, I'll go with Bavarian too, because they have maybe this is not answering the question correctly, but their beer garden is amazing. It is like straight out of Munich, except like if Munich were like nicer, maybe. I don't know. I mean, I haven't been to Munich. I'm sorry, but I'm kind of telling on myself here. Telling on myself here, but it's basically like a park, except there's just tables everywhere, and it's comfortable. Spring, summer, fall in Milwaukee are all wonderful. So there's a lot of time. Like I know, like we get a lot of rap for winters, but there's a lot of great outdoor beer drinking time in Milwaukee, and it's just a phenomenal place to do it. There's kind of like food stations set up in different places, so you can get your currywursts and all the stuff. So I'll go with Bavarian.
And can this be where we devolve? Because
yes.
I have to say that
it's a good spot to devolve.
Yeah, in the last few years, the beer garden in Milwaukee has just gone through the roof. Which is ironic since there is no roof. But like every park, every open space has become a beer garden. It's almost become a joke. There are so many beer. Like last year, I did a beer garden guide, and I spent like every week I'd have to add a new beer garden to it because it was just going and going and going. There's like a chain of for-profit beer gardens. Every major city park has beer gardens run by the county parks in partnership with other people. There are literally just beer gardens everywhere, and it's because our winter is so cold and we're all hibernating for so long that as soon as the weather gets nice, we want to be outside, and we want to be outside with other people drinking beer.
And are these places, these beer gardens, are they in affiliation with local breweries, or are they just local bars and restaurants, or are they just sort of independent operators? I know you mentioned like the county or the city.
All of those things. Yeah. They're all of those things. So like 1840 has its own series of beer gardens in one of the suburbs. New Barons does its own beer garden in another suburb called Fox Point.
Almost every little suburb that has a park has a different affiliation with, or an affiliation with a small, almost all of them really small, local craft brewery. It's very cool.
Right.
Very
and
cool.
then
I'm glad you mentioned that.
Yeah, and then some also have beer from everybody. So it is sort of a mix of things. Yeah,
I'm a big fan of outdoor beer drinking. Big fan of beer gardens. Written about them quite a bit in my career, and now I need to get back to Milwaukee even more. Bobby, we'll go back to you for this next question. Best historic bar in Milwaukee.
Historic bar from like a brewing standpoint, or just in general?
No, just general. One that maybe has some vibe, ambiance, architecture, history. Just obviously there are a lot of bars that have been there for more than 10 or 15 years.
getting
Yeah.
into considerably older. Which one would you recommend?
There are tons, and I feel like by naming any one, I'm leaving out like 10 more that I should name, but I am going to pick one, and I'm going to say Regano's Roman Coin on Brady Street, which is in an old Pabst tied house. And the woman who owns it, her dad owned it before her, so they've owned it for nearly 60 years. It still has tons of original woodwork, the original wood floors. I mean, it looks like a Milwaukee bar when you go inside. And if you're lucky, don't tell her I told you this, but if you're lucky, Terry will show you the old bowling alleys in the basement.
That's an amazing tip. Love it. Love it. Chris, how about for you, best historic bar in Milwaukee? Chris looks
I don't know if
he just looks
one.
pained.
I mean, there are so many bars in Milwaukee, and I feel like half of them were probably tied houses at some point. Those iconic corner bars with the turret on top, and
that's how I make my living.
Yeah, I know.
Writing about all those.
I feel like I want to see that and have Bobby answer another one.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing that I feel like people don't necessarily appreciate about Milwaukee is just sort of the history. And Chicago had this for a long time, but has been losing it so increasingly with the neighborhood bars and the historic bars. It's I'm very happy to hear that Milwaukee is at least trying to preserve it or still has so much to offer. But we'll forgive Chris here, and we'll throw him a nice easy question for the next one, which is Chris, what's your top 3 breweries for lager in the city?
Okay, this one's right in my wheelhouse. So I'll say, I mean, Lakefront I think is probably the top one. They've had 35 years to dial in their lager program, and all their seasonals are not all their seasonals are lagers, but a lot of their repeating seasonals are lagers, and they're really well done. Maibach, Oktoberfest. They've introduced a bunch of summer beer, like an American lager that's just a year round. River West Stein and Eastside Dark, both great. So I think that's in the catbird seat for me. Gathering Place is one of the class of 2017, I believe. So they're a little bit newer, but they're in the neighborhood, which is a great kind of brewery hotspot, and a lot of focus on continental styles. Their flagship is a Kolsch, or as Corey would say, a Kolsch style ale. He's a stickler about that. But a lot of great lagers, including a really nice Schwartz beer and a cool unfiltered Helles. They've got a nice rye Dunkel. A lot of really good beers there, and it's awesome. It's also a really nice tap room. And I think for the third one, I'm going to go off the board a little bit and say Component. I have been really. This is a brewery that's let's see. They opened in 2019. Was it, Bobby?
Yeah.
A little bit newer, like since 16, 17. But they have one of those beer programs that has that kind of bifurcation to it, where you've got your kind of hazies and some fruited sours and stuff like that. But they have like kind of dad beers that I've been really enjoying. A couple different pilsners you'll find. I know it's not a lager, but they tend to have Hefeweizen on. I think they had a Czech dark lager the other day. Recently. I know they just did the Native Lands Mexican lager.
Yeah,
so I'm excited to get over there and try that one. So
just came this week. Yeah.
Yeah, and one other thing that's cool about Component is it's located in this big former warehouse. It's called the Lincoln Warehouse down in Bayview, which is one of the great neighborhoods in the city. And there's actually 3 breweries in there and a distillery tap room. So there's a chocolatier, it's a great spot to kind of go and walk around and just kind of hit all the spots.
Bobby, where are you going for lager?
I hate to say this, but Chris named my 3.
Okay.
So I would add to that. It's not a brewery that does a ton of lagers, but I think they do really good ones. Is Good City. I like their home lager and their Good City Pils. They also did a really nice Oktoberfest last year. And they have a seasonal that I think is called Afterglow. It's like a dark lager that I really like. So again, they're not probably in terms of sheer quantity of kinds of lagers, they're not high up there, but I feel like they always do a really good job.
And Bobby, where are you sending folks for IPA? And now IPA is a massive, broad category. West Coast or hazy. There's a whole host of things. But just where are 3 places that you think are doing exceptional IPA in Milwaukee?
I would say one of them is Eagle Park, which is a brewery that does a seemingly endless variety of beers. And they started small. Interestingly, they started in the Lincoln warehouse that Chris was talking about, and they started in this tiny brewing space on the second floor, which has since been home to 3 other breweries, including Component, the one that Chris mentioned. And they've grown out of that into like they bought a closed brew pub, and then they expanded into just this huge facility in a southwestern suburb called Muskego, and now they've just expanded that even further. They've opened up a distillery in there, and they do a really good New England IPA called David Bowie Spacesuit. Everything sort of has like a music related name because they were in a band called Eagle Trace. And they have a nice sessionable IPA that's called, I think, Push Play. And then sort of falling in between is another one called Setlist, which is pretty nice. Then I would say Third Space, which is another brewery that opened kind of around that 2016 era that Chris was talking about, and doesn't seem to have ever stopped expanding. Like every time I go there, they're loading another tank off a semi, so they've gotten their beers into the stadium, the Brewer Stadium. They're in the Bucks Fiserv Forum. They've done really well for themselves in terms of distribution. But they do like a hazy called Heavenly Haze. That's nice. A really juicy sessionable one called Juice Fix that I think is only even just like 4% or something, the kind of beer you could drink loads of. And then I would say Venture does really nice IPAs too. And they're sort of a neighborhood brewery that often flies there because they're a coffee shop in the morning, although I guess you could drink beer there in the morning if you wanted to, and a brewery in the evening. And again, I guess you could have coffee there in the evening if you want, but they do a really nice job on some great IPAs. And I think it's one that people just don't think about that much because it's very rooted in its neighborhood in Washington Heights.
And Chris, how about yourself? Where are you going for IPA in Milwaukee?
Well, I had Eagle Park and Third Space on my list, but I'll also add 1840, which is 1840 Brewing it's a reference to when the first brewery started in Milwaukee that Bobby mentioned earlier. This is a brewery that is very contemporary in terms of like they're doing a lot of really good hazy beers, pushing the envelope on sours. I mean, they originally started as kind of like the hook was an urban farmhouse brewery, so they were looking at a lot of mixed firm and barrel aged stuff like that. And I think they found their groove with hazy beer, with hazy IPAs, and they've got a nice series of kind of pastry stout type stuff, and they still do a lot of the sours and fruited stuff like that. So and a really nice tap room in Bayview as well. And then one other one I'll mention, this is a really new one, Amorphic Brewing is in River West, and it's a pretty small tap room. They don't have a lot of like distribution or anything, but man, really doing really cool stuff with like hop extracts and really kind of leaning into innovation and unusual techniques and stuff like that to kind of coax out all the intense like crazy flavor. But they also have a pretty cool instead of having like a kind of a section of the menu that's like lagers, he's doing like Czech beers, so like pills and like dark but like kind of twists on very kind of cross-pollinating concepts and just unusual stuff you're going to find at Amorphic. So
you had mentioned sour or mixed fermentation beer, so we'll stick with you for this one, Chris. Where are you going in the city for sour or mixed ferm beer?
This is an exciting one because it's kind of new to the city. At least their physical space is open now, and that's Supermoon Beer Company, which is in on Howell Avenue down in Bayview. And this is Rob Brennan is kind of a one-man show. It has been, at least, but he's doing just super deep terroir kind of like blending a lot of slow beer. And just last fall, or was it late summer, maybe, he opened his tap room to the public after doing bottle releases for I think a couple of years. The plan was originally to open in like late 2020, and we all know what happened then. So with the nature of those kinds of beers, he just kind of slow rolled it and kept building up a barrel stock and keg stock. And now we're reaping the benefits of that. So really, really compelling stuff, super nuanced and flavorful. And he has a really nice flagship saison too. That's kind of the clean beer of the mix. So Supermoon, I mentioned 1840. That would be in my top three as well. And one brewery we haven't talked about is Mobcraft, and
this is a brewery I'm interested in talking about. So
yeah, so they've been around for maybe a decade or so now, but they were a part of their physical space was open during that 16-17 boom here in Milwaukee in the Walker's Point neighborhood. And their model is crowdsourcing their beers. So they have a website where you can like vote, first of all, submit a recipe. So you can like say, I want a peanut butter strawberry cream ale or something like that, and then they will either, and with whatever kind of degree of detail that you're interested in, if you're a home brewer, you can submit like a detailed recipe. If you just want a concept, you can do that. Mm-hmm. And then it goes through voting in their social channels, and it kind of gets voted up. And then once it comes down to it, like each vote is essentially like an order. So you're kind of putting your money. So, otherwise you could end up with some pretty weird stuff, and they do end up with some pretty weird stuff even with that. But, and that was kind of the innovation model for their, early on. I think they've kind of, some of those beers have become like regular beers for them now. But one of the things that, the reason I brought it up is they've got a really nice wild beer program that includes it's basically like a Solera beer where it's a real gently tart beer. It's called Low Funk with pH as the funk because it's slightly low pH, but it's also kind of low funk. It's just a little bit of tartness, but it is mixed firm tartness. It's not just a kettle sour. So there's a little bit of added depth to it. It's a really nice beer, but like kind of Flanders style beers, and it's a pretty broad range of what they're doing with their sour program, and I think it's of note. And I would say that it's not an area where Milwaukee has a lot of action too. So I guess
Mobcraft's an interesting place. I was in Madison in probably late 2014, actually, visiting friends, and I was out there, I think, with the Beer Advocate guys who were visiting, I think, a publisher at that point, and we went around and did a variety of breweries. But we're in Madison. I think it might have been a place called One Barrel at the time, which seemed like a crazy idea. It was kind of that nano era. And I ran into the founders at that place, and they were telling me about this idea, and it just seemed wild. This idea of and they've kicked around for a while, and they obviously moved from Madison out to Milwaukee, and then they've now got tap rooms in Denver and a bunch of other cities as well. So it was just kind of a fascinating model that I don't know that we've seen the like of almost anywhere else.
They also have production agreements with some other brewers here that don't have homes, like Radix Fermentation and Rookery, who come in and use their system. And so it's not exactly contract brewing because these people are doing the brewing themselves, but they're basically contracting their equipment to these other breweries. So they really have their kind of tentacles out in a variety of different things.
And Bobby, where are you going for sour mixed fermentation beer?
Again, maybe it's just because, as Chris said, it's not a huge thing here yet. I picked the same three as him, and I would throw in for Rob Brennan at Supermoon. I'd throw in that lawnmower that Bayview Saison he does is. I joked it's like a lawnmower Saison because it's super low alcohol, super smooth, easy drinking. Not like you'd ever expect. And then Mobcraft, because they do so many different beers and so many different sours, and they have the Sour Fest, which is like a huge event. And then they also do their Weird Fest, which is a lot of beers like Chris suggested. What was that? A peanut butter strawberry
cream ale.
Yeah, I just made that up.
Yeah.
We could probably look up some of the ones that they've actually done, and they'd be way weirder.
They're way weirder than that. Yeah. And then I guess I would throw in Radix Fermentation, which is one of the brewers that uses Mobcraft's facility, because they're another one that's sort of like doing that 1840 kind of urban farmhouse thing. They grow a lot of their ingredients themselves in their backyard in Wauwatosa, and they do some good sours there as well.
Bobby, what is a one can't miss beer bar for people who are coming into Milwaukee?
Oh, there's a couple, but I would say Draft and Vessel is probably the one can't miss. And there's two locations. There's one in the northern old streetcar suburb called Shorewood, and then the other one is in Wauwatosa to the west. But then I would also throw in a quick shout out to Irv's Mug in Oak Creek to the south of the city, because they do such a good job and have done that for a really long time, supporting local craft beer. And they do an amazing event every fall called Irvtoberfest. And during the shutdown, when they couldn't do it in person, they were doing a case of Wisconsin Oktoberfests for like $40, which was an insane deal.
It's amazing.
It was amazing.
Chris, how about yourself? What's one can't miss beer bar?
One. If it's just one, I'm gonna pick the Sugar Maple, which is another one in the Bayview neighborhood. We're referencing the Bayview neighborhood a lot. If you're traveling, that's probably, you should be picking up on that, what we're laying down. Sugar Maple is it is a beer bar, but it is an art bar. It is a community hub bar. It is very inclusive. They do all these cool events. Just last weekend they had a Wes Anderson what was it, like a takeover,
like a themed
theme?
Like a themed pop-up kind of thing.
Yeah, pop-up, right, is what they're calling it. And so like just good people, good events. It feels good to be in there, and you can have 30, your choice of 30 like exceptional, mostly local taps.
And they support local jazz, which is important.
I support that. I love it. Bobby, if friends are coming in, from out of town, and there's, maybe a neighborhood, that you want to pub crawl in, Chris is, talking about one particular neighborhood, where's one that you would, you think for certain people should, from coming in from out of town should visit? And then what's one that, maybe folks would miss, maybe it doesn't get enough love as it should?
I think Bayview as Chris said, is a pretty obvious choice, because in the Lincoln Warehouse alone, you have 3 breweries and a distillery, and then you can walk a couple of blocks and be at 1840. You could walk another block and be at Enlightened. Plus, Sugar Maple is nearby. You're not far from Supermoon, as we talked about. So that's a really good choice. Tons of great restaurants around there. Tons of great there's cocktail bars like. All over there. At Random is there, which is like a classic kind of 50s, 60s style ice cream drinks kind of place. The one place that you sort of shouldn't miss is River West, because that has 5 great breweries, including Lakefront, Black Husky, which every year makes a beer from the city Christmas tree. with the spruce tips.
That's amazing.
This Company Brewing is there, Gathering Place, which we talked about, which Chris had talked about, Amorphic, which Chris also talked about. And the best thing is now on Saturdays, I think it is, they run a shuttle. The breweries got together to run a shuttle between those breweries, so you could park at one of them and take a shuttle to all of them. So
smart.
Those would be my two neighborhoods.
And Chris, how about yourself? What's one place that people should be going, and that they would visit, and another place that they might miss?
So I think Bayview is kind of the flag, like that's the really easy one. And I guess I'd also mention Walker's Point, which is just north of Bayview. It's a very urban, kind of almost like a downtown-y type neighborhood still. And that's where you'll find Momcraft, and there's a brewery called Broken Bat there. What am I missing, Bobby?
Indeed is there.
Indeed is a really good one. There's a really small brewery with a really cool tap room called Urban Harvest. The beer is not the best, but it's a really good neighborhood vibe. And so yeah, Walker, and again, both Walker's Point and Bayview, there's just awesome restaurants all over the place. So I think that's probably the other one. And then as far as can't miss, or kind of under the radar, there's a stretch running of North Avenue on the west side of town that runs from this is my local, my favorite local venture, which is the coffee shop brewery hybrid. From there going west about maybe 20-30 blocks, there's about let's see, is it 4 brewery tap rooms, including there's the Fermentorium, which is a brewery that has they do pretty good lagers too. They don't do a ton of them, but they've got awesome bocks. They have an awesome Doppelbock and a great Maibach, and some other good beers too. There's a Gathering Place location on North Avenue as well that just opened up, and then the newest kid on the block is Lion's Tail, which is a tap room of a brewery in Neenah, which is up north a little, not up north. See, Wisconsin people, up north means a different thing than just north of the city, but in the Fox. It's a small city in the Fox Valley that does pretty good traditional styles and is pretty well known for sours and hazies and all that kind of stuff. A modern brewery and with a really nice tap room, great outdoor space once that's going. So it's not quite as concentrated and put together as River West is, but worth a shot if you're in town for quite a while.
Well, that's a good one too, because then you could just go a couple of blocks west to Ray's Wine and Spirits, which has a great beer selection and also has a great sort of beer bar up above too.
And Bobby, we've talked about a variety of breweries here, but obviously I think we talked somewhere in the neighborhood of 40 breweries in Milwaukee or in that neighboring area. We haven't mentioned all of them, obviously, and we won't. But what is one great place that doesn't get enough attention or is flying under the radar?
I mentioned Enlightened as one of the Bayview breweries, and that is one that I think does a solid job on IPAs and lagers and doesn't get a ton of mentions, but also in a beautiful tap room that is in what I like about, and this is true in lots of places, not just Milwaukee, but Milwaukee being such an industrial city with a huge manufacturing history. It's great that so many breweries have opened up in former manufacturing facilities and that sort of thing. So it's really cool to see, and Enlightened is one of them. It's in the old Louis Alice plant, which was huge during World War II, making all sorts of things. And the people who run it are nice. The tap room's great. The beer's good. Enlightened.
And Chris, how about for yourself, a place that maybe, one of these breweries that doesn't get enough attention or is kind of flying under the radar? Yeah,
this is one that's a little bit off the board because you could argue that it's not even really in Milwaukee, but Raised Grain is in Waukesha, which is, I guess it's kind of a suburb. It's definitely its own city, but maybe 20-25 minutes from downtown, and really solid beers. Some really I'm not sure if it's their flagship really anymore, but they've got a beer called Paradox Red, and it's an Imperial Red IPA. And if that sounds like a throwback, like kind of a throwback beer, I guess it is, but
it's a great style. It's just a great undervalued style. I love it.
And they have a little bit of a Belgian bent to a lot of their beers. They've got a nice Belgian Imperial Stout, and a good mix of kind of like regular beers too. I guess I'm kind of mentioned two Imperial things, but and nice tap room, good food out there too. So it's Waukesha is kind of a somebody recommending something from Waukesha for Milwaukee people is maybe a little off the board, but but
it's a good choice.
But it's a really good brewery, and I think good people too.
And I'll go with Bobby on this one. This is a question that sometimes is a little bit controversial, and we either have people who have very strong answers or people who absolutely do not want to answer it whatsoever. And we'll find out where you two fall on this. But are there any breweries that you think need to step up their games or have been slacking?
Ooh, I'm going to sidestep this carefully.
There we go.
Possible, and just say that one thing I think that the city's brewing scene as a whole could do better is inclusiveness. I would love to see more sort of brewers of color being sort of welcomed and supported and opening here. And I don't know that anybody here would say that they wouldn't support them. That maybe it just hasn't really happened yet. But there's Venture has one owner of color, and there's a guy named Chris Adams who started a company called CAC Brewing, and he's brewing out of Mobcraft. But beyond that, there really isn't much. And with the brewing scene sort of rightly paying attention to this more than ever, I feel like Milwaukee really needs to kind of step that game up.
Fair enough. And for Chris, now you've had a minute to think about it or so. What breweries do you think need to step up their games or have been slacking? You've been at this a while. You're a critic. You're somebody who I know isn't afraid to usually pull punches in his writing.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. That's a compliment. One of the I will name a name. One of the breweries that started out really strong, I think, and with just the brand, the concept, was Good City. And I think they've been a little uneven lately. I think some of their beers have come around, but I want to see more diversity in what they're making, and I want to see better execution a little bit. And I also will mention Sprecher. There's the reputation, at least in the, and I think it has gotten better in the last couple of years with the new ownership, as far as like just branding and the concept of what they're trying to do. But I still think they're trying to have it both ways and lean into their history and their great lagers. I mean, you mentioned like when you said like this beer that's like a landmark around the country, and I wasn't sure what you were going to say, and you said Black Bavarian. I'm like, oh yeah. Like that, they're not really embracing that beer, and it is a phenomenal beer, and it still is. Like their classic styles are still on point and very good, but they're trying to kind of have a foot in the future as well, and I don't think it's working, and from a branding perspective or really an execution perspective. So I think both of those breweries have enough talent and kind of like goodwill in the community to pull it out and get better. And I'll say one thing about Good City too is their spaces are so good. Like especially that East Side tap room is quite it's a good place to have a beer. It's a good place to have a meal, and it feels good. And it's not like the beer is bad, but it's just been a little uneven, and I'd like to see it said with love.
Always. That's what we're always doing. We've talked a lot about Milwaukee's history, its heritage, its place in kind of, in the modern day and how it's come along. Bobby, is someone who probably travels and is interested in beer across the country, and is an observer of things in this industry. How do you think Milwaukee stacks up beer-wise against other cities in the U.S. at this point?
I think we're doing pretty good. I've been trying to get out to more Midwestern cities than I'd been getting to for a while. And so in the last 2 summers, I was in Des Moines, Kansas City, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati. And so I feel like they're sort of all in the more or less in our ballpark, and I feel like we're in pretty good standing, I think, in there. I mean, some of those maybe have a little, I would say Kansas City has maybe a slight edge on us, but partially that might be because their streetcar is so perfectly aligned that it allows you to get to nearly every brewery in the city pretty easily. But I think in terms of scene, I think we're doing pretty good. I think.
Chris, the first time and actually the only time I've met Chris was in one of the more random experiences I'm sure either of us have had. I happened to be at a brewery here. I'm in Boston, at Trillium. I had opened this kind of new sort of tap room and tiny nano brewery in the Fenway neighborhood. And I can't remember exactly. I think there was somebody who was wearing a brewer's hat. It may have been what attracted to me, and I, happened to amble over and make some mention of it. And eventually, we figured out. I don't know if it was through Twitter or whatever it was, that it was Chris, and it was somebody who I'd not met before, but had followed for a long time. And so now I know he's someone who does travel around a little bit. And Chris, how does the beer in Milwaukee stack up against other cities?
I mean, I think I think that we're back to where we should be. That has, like, we're literally Brew City, so not, and it's not for craft beer, obviously, that nickname, but I think we can wear that now. I mean, the breweries that have come in since in the last 6 or 7 years have elevated, that, and not that Lakefront, wasn't carrying that standard, but you can't have just one brewery. You got to have a bunch. And I think the experiences at a lot of these places, when you go, it feels good. And, it's like, we're very good at hospitality here. There's so many bars. There's so much of that, like, kind of culture of, I mean, it's drinking culture. Like, we talk about this in Wisconsin a lot, about the downsides of it, but the upsides of it, especially as a visitor, will be manifest. You will feel the Gemütlichkeit when you come to Milwaukee, and I think the breweries can be a part of that. I'm glad we talked a lot about, like, kind of the bar scenes and those aspects of the city too, because I think that's if you're coming from Chicago, that's not going to be all that unique. But if you're coming from, Ohio or California, for sure, that is a really distinctive place. Like, we didn't get to the dive bar question, Andy, which is okay. But, like, the definition of a dive bar in Wisconsin, it's like, oh, you don't want to go to that place. To me, is the way I think about it. And I think other places, it's like, oh, it's just not like corporate or like polished or in a strip mall.
True.
It's like, that is like 80% of the bars, the good ones in Milwaukee and in Wisconsin. So I think, as you're setting your itinerary for Milwaukee, yes, do all these breweries that we talked about, or probably not all of them. But that, make time to just stop at a bar. It can be pretty much a random bar in any of these areas, and you're going to have a good time. Get some pull tabs, order some curds,
right?
Have a high life too. It's, that's Wisconsin.
We're going to have a glossary at the end of this episode. It'll be appended to all of this, so people would have no idea what Chris is talking about and the glories that Wisconsin and Milwaukee have to offer. We'll get you up to speed. It's a city I love. It's a city I miss. It's a city that I think is certainly undervalued and underappreciated. And I know several folks from the Midwest or from the East Coast here who have come out to visit just for holidays, and were blown away, just for a quick vacation or a quick weekend at how amazing the city is. And I think you both really did a great job of capturing it. And I'm looking forward to folks, learning more about Milwaukee and hopefully getting out there. But we'll start with Bobby. Where can people find you online and your work?
They can find pretty much everything I do at onmilwaukee.com, onmilwaukee.com. And I do a series called Urban Spelunking, which is not going illegally into dangerous places and dangling off skyscrapers, but more like sort of digging into the history of buildings and and the city, and a lot of those buildings are tied houses, former tied houses and
Mhm.
bars and breweries and beer related stuff.
And Chris, how about yourself?
Probably the place where it all comes together from the various outlets is my Twitter, which is WI Beer Baron. That's Baron with one R. And you can catch us every Wednesday night at 8 o'clock Central. We do a live stream with a couple of co-hosts that covers kind of all things going on in Milwaukee or in Wisconsin beer. So there's that. That's probably the best of it. Definitely check out, if you're coming to the city, definitely check out Milwaukee Mag, mag.com. That's where we have, that's where all my work for the magazine is. And there's lots of, guides and stuff like that for, making sure you're getting the essential Milwaukee experience. So, and Bobby's outlet is too. It's funny because we are a little bit stepping on each other sometimes on scoops and the beer news and really a lot of our outlets cover a lot of the same things, but Bobby and I are friends and it was fun to catch up with you, dude.
And I have to say that sort of, I feel like our relationship is sort of representative of what you said about the beer scene in Milwaukee and about like the hospitality in Milwaukee, is that like, I know that technically you're competition, but I don't generally ever really feel all that much in competition with you. And if you get a scoop that I didn't get, I'm always just kind of happy that you got it. And
we bring people together here on Beer Travelers, and I think it's also a fantastic testament to the town that most cities don't really have anybody covering beer with any regularity, and in Milwaukee is very lucky to have you both, as were we today. So Bobby and Chris, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Andy.
Pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Beer Travelers podcast. If you have a suggestion for a town we should visit next, please drop us a line at podcast@allaboutbeer.com. Please give our podcast a review wherever you listen. It really helps folks find out about us. And if you like the episode, tell a friend and post on your socials. Interested in learning more about connecting with an engaged, energetic, and interested audience of curious beer consumers and brewers? We have many different advertising opportunities, including through our podcasts, website, newsletter, and social media channels. For more information, please contact us at podcast@allaboutbeer.com. All About Beer is back, and we're asking for your support to help provide the independent beer media this rich and colorful industry deserves. Visit our website, allaboutbeer.com, where we're frequently posting new content. And please consider throwing us a few bucks at patreon.com/allaboutbeer. We have low-cost memberships for individuals and small and large companies alike. Every dollar goes to help produce new articles and podcasts. My pick for a place to have a beer in Milwaukee is Von Trier. A classic old German spot in Milwaukee's East Side, your first step into the bar will leave a lasting impression. The lighting is low, almost theatrical, framing the massive 50-year-old three-part German cultural mural hovering over the large bar, which is surrounded by dozens of Steinkrugs. Hovering over the room is a chandelier dating to the early 1890s that was commissioned by Captain Frederick Pabst himself. The wrought iron and antler ironwork is a statement piece in a room of statement pieces. There's no shortage of things to check out in this bar, and you'll probably spend more time looking at the ceiling than at your beer.